All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's session. Today we have a special guest. His name is Rishi, and he will be a first year at Cornell University. So Rishi has a presentation prepared for us. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, uh, we do like ask that you put your questions in the chat, and then during the Q&A session, they will be answered, and then we'll have a open-ended conversation type of thing. So Rishi, you can share your screen and we can get started.
Great, thank you, Preet. So before I start, I know there's a lot of people in the room right now, and I want to figure out if you guys are like new to the application process or if you guys know a lot about it. So if you guys are new to the application process and aren't like don't know a lot about it, just put like a one in the chat. And if you know a lot about the process, just put a zero. And based on the response, I'll kind of like edit what I'm gonna say um, to make it make sense to most people. Yeah, so one if this is your first time, and then zero if you've gone to a few talks and you know a lot. Okay, so from everyone that responded, it seems like we have a lot of newcomers. So I'll try to talk about everything um, and explain everything. Okay, I'll just share my screen. Okay, and can everyone see this?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. So, okay, my name is Rishi Gujar. I'm an incoming freshman at Cornell. And I'm actually going to be moving into my dorm in like 6 days. So I'm going to have to fly out of Fremont. I'm majoring in environment and sustainability as well as applied math. Like I'm intending to do like a dual major. And I like early in the application process, which I did last summer, I was planning on applying to a lot of schools. Um, but since I applied ED to Cornell, which means early decision is kind of like a binding agreement with the school. So if the school accepts your offer, then you have to remove all of your other acceptances or and all of your other applications to other schools, and you're kind of like you've signed a contract to go to the school. So I applied to all of the UCs. I applied to University of Michigan, Santa Clara University, and Cornell. And since I got into Cornell early decision, I already got my Santa Clara University acceptance, but for my UCs and for my other applications, I had to remove them. So I still don't know if I got it or not. So in high school, I went to American high school for 4 years. Over the course of the high school, I took around 11 APs. I took 10 of them within the school, and then I took one of them externally, which during my sophomore year on this service called UC Scout. UC Scout is kind of like it's like an online tool similar to Khan Academy, but it is paid and it allows you to take AP credit courses, and they give you a transcript. And then after you take the courses, and they're very, very thorough, and you take their internal tests, you can take an AP test, and it's better than self-studying for the AP because you get like a very comprehensive curriculum, and you also get a transcript that you can give colleges. And then also during high school, I took one dual enrollment course at Ohlone College, which was focused on AWS machine learning, and it was around 4 credits. So I took my SAT in my sophomore and junior years, and I took it around like 3 times. And the best score out of all of those times was a 1540. So I went with that score. They generally say that if you think that your SAT score represents your application, then you should submit it if the university gives you a choice. But if you think it undersells you, then it's better not to submit it. And I thought my SAT score adequately represented my application. So, and since I took 11 APs, it kind of like boosted my GPA. for the weighted side. So I ended the year or ended high school with like around like a 4.25 GPA. Okay, so I'm going to spend most of this to talk about my extracurriculars because in my application, that's what I kind of like focused on since I thought my grades and everything else didn't represent my application enough. And in my application, I had three different themes and I kind of combined them to tell my story. So the first one was research, the second is environmental and climate education, and the third one is environmental stewardship. And all of these are really spiked towards environmental science, which was my major, like right here. So there's like when college admissions, like people talk about applications, they either talk about well-rounded applications or really spiked applications. And well-rounded applications kind of like have a student that has done everything. So they might have joined the robotics club, they might have like been on their track team, they might have done Boy Scouts, they might have like been in band, etc. So there's when you see all of that, there's not really like a clear spike that you can pinpoint. But for me, I was kind of the opposite of that. In my sophomore year, I kind of realized exactly what I wanted to do, which was related to environmental science. So everything I did after realizing that was highly focused to environmental causes, which allowed me to really spike my application. Um, like people talk about whether like a spiked application is really good or really bad. And it really varies depending on college, but I wouldn't try to engineer it. I would just do whatever like makes the most sense. So I'm gonna share my resume because I think that might be like a bit more like clear to you guys than like this like really simple sheet. And I'll just go through it. So I prepared this resume to like show to my colleges, and during the application process, you can actually submit your resume to the Common App. So I'll start off with my research. So I interned, I'll start off at the bottom. So in my sophomore year over the summer, I did this research program called Polygens. And during the research program, I did research on fungi community structure. And I was able to write a paper on it and present it at this symposium. So that gave me like an initial background in research, which I was able to kind of like use as a foundation to get other opportunities. After that, I joined this lab at Stanford where I analyzed fish farming and I looked at like the environmental impact of fish farming. And we're actually submitting this paper and waiting in review at the moment at this journal. So I did get really far. And then last summer, I went to MIT over the summer and I looked at deforestation and I did research on using satellite imagery to analyze deforestation. So you can kind of see the trend where I'm like getting more and more into research, and all of it is really focused on environmental research to some aspect. And yeah, and you guys can ask questions a bit later. So for my second theme, which was environment and climate education, I did a lot in this space, which is why I kind of like put so much in my resume. So the first thing that I did was I passed this climate literacy resolution at the FUSD Board of Education. And after that passed, this FUSD network formed within the district. So that was like a pretty prominent part of my journey. And I talked about it over here. I was also involved at a local nonprofit called the Sierra Club, and I did a few things like writing that resolution. I was featured on the website a few times. I helped push for this $200 million climate funding bill at the state level. And then I also wrote an article for the NGO. So I talked about that. And then the third theme is environmental stewardship. So the first thing and the most prominent part of my application was this organization called Beyond Terra, which I founded during my sophomore year of high school. And since this was an organization that I founded and I lead still to this day, I put a lot of emphasis about this in my application. And I talked about like the projects that we've led, like the impact and some of the stuff we've done. And at the Sierra Club, I was also the head of this committee, and then a few miscellaneous stuff. I led the Sign Eco Club at my school. And then I was on the FTC team at my school for the first 2 years of high school as well. So that kind of like shows my ECs, but let me just share. Okay. Yeah, so broadly speaking, it was very like spiked towards climate and environment. And I kind of did all of this and went as deep as I could. So whenever I joined like an extracurricular, I didn't stay a member. I tried to become like the leader or like the president of the club. And I think when I did apply to these schools, that's something that stood out to them since I had a lot of leadership on my application. So yeah, so I talked about the school clubs. Some other stuff I put on my application were some invited talks that I gave that came as a result of my extracurriculars. So I gave some talks at like Columbia University, at a few local nonprofits, and at this event led by a local state senator. And a lot of that helped on my application, especially since it was like really like a bit more rare than like a leadership position. And then I did get some press. I'm not sure how helpful that is for an application since it's like really hard to get and it's not something that you can like specifically aim for. But it did come as a result of my leadership. And every time I got like mentioned in an article or like interviewed or whatever, I did note that on my application. And then some of the honors that I got were, maybe I can share my resume again. Okay. Yeah, so at the bottom, so I did the science fair, and I got moved up to the California level. So I talked about that. There was some local award by a local NGO. There's like the AP Scholar with Distinction Award, which you get if you get, I think like fives on AP tests. And then I participated in this climate science competition. And then this was another like environmental leadership award. But yeah. And then some of the other stuff, like I think I spent like the most time on the essays during the application process, and you'll hear that a lot, and it is very true. Out of all of the essays, you have like the Common App personal statement, which is a really long essay. I think it's around 650 words. And then you also have specific essays for every school. So the Common App personal statement kind of gets sent to every single school other than the UCs. So you really want to make that really like, you really want to work on that the most. And it is quite long. A lot of like the individual essays that schools ask for are like 350 words. But this one is like, I think around 650 words. So it gives you much more time to like talk about your story. So I started in the summer, like coming into my senior year, and I spent I think around like 2 months iterating and crafting the story, and it took a long time. I think the biggest piece of advice I could give is you really like it's not something that I like worked on for a week. It's something that like I really took a lot of time to think about what I did over the last 3 or 4 years. I try to find like trends within like within the work I've done. I try to like pinpoint individual stories that stood out to me, and then I try to craft that into like one long story that conveyed like my personal statement, and that's why it's kind of called personal statement. And I did kind of adapt my personal statement and write it in like a article that like a nonprofit commissioned me for. So I'm gonna add it to the chat, so that way it's not exactly my personal statement, but it is like a majority my personal statement. So it might give you guys some inspiration. And I think it's around the same word count. So you guys can read through it. It's pretty long. And then on the letters of recommendation, this is kind of like a more minor part of the application, but something I looked for and something that they generally recommend is having like one teacher from the humanities side and then one teacher from the STEM side to represent your application. For me, I only got AP teachers to give me letters of rec. But if you have a teacher that you've really connected with and kind of like knows you in the classroom, like you've raised your hand a lot, you've talked to them a lot, and you have a really good academic record within their class, I would suggest going to them and kind of like asking them early. So if you're still going into your junior year, maybe asking them around the end of your junior year, that would be good instead of waiting all the way to senior year. But if you're still coming into like sophomore or junior year, just like setting a really good like just like speaking to your teachers a lot, raising your hand a lot, and like standing out in the classroom are like some basic things. But letters of rec are a minor part of the application, but they can help you stand out if the admissions officers think you're like equal to another student. And then some of the external letters of rec I got were from professors. So since I did apply to Cornell, I had a connection to a Cornell professor. So he wrote to the dean of admissions, and I think that helped my application. But and I also got letters of rec from like an MIT professor and a Stanford professor, but I had to remove those applications. So technically, I never got those. But for any extracurriculars you do, I would suggest like having a strong connection and like keeping that connection with leaders that you meet, especially if they're adults. That way, later on, even if you've moved on from the extracurricular, you can ask them to speak about the work you did back then. Okay, I think that's all I prepared. Feel free to add questions to the chat, but that was like a very brief rundown on my application. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Rishi. So, I think that was a very solid presentation. So what we can do is we can transition into the slideshow, or sorry, the Q&A portion. While you were presenting, there were a few questions that came in the chat as well as privately DM me. So I will share them. This is a document that we'll share with the rest of the group chat members at the end of the session. So here were some questions that were asked. So Rishi, again, if you feel uncomfortable sharing something, just let me know. But the first question was, what were some extracurriculars that you feel had a strong impact on your college application?
Okay, yeah. So like there's different levels of extracurriculars in your college application. For example, if you're on a robotics team and you're like a member, then an admissions officer will look at that and they'll acknowledge that you're like doing an activity, but they'll also note that it's like a team activity. And if you don't have a leadership position, that will put you in a different position than if you do. So my most prominent EC was the nonprofit that I made called Beyond Terra. Since I founded that myself and I served as the executive director, that like I was able to paint that as a very prominent part. It was a very prominent leadership position. And I was able to talk about like the team I helped form, the awards that we won, the projects I helped lead, different things I learned. And I think that stood out a lot. I think some of the other things, I think the second most prominent thing was my research that I've done. Since I was able to get a few of them like published, um, that was like a bit more rare, and the college admissions officers don't see that as often. So I was also able to apply my research in competitions like the science fair and get a few awards. So yeah, like I think that prominent leadership position as well as research had like the most impact.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. And the second question was, what are some tips you may have for students that are just starting high school?
So like my tips, I think the biggest tip I would offer I would give two tips. The first one is take the most rigorous courses you can. I think one of the things that I didn't do initially was like I took like easier classes because I thought colleges would not really like care about that. But later on, I realized that they really want to see that you're challenging yourself. And if you want to apply to like one of the more higher tier colleges that are harder to get into, a lot of the students that do apply are taking the hardest courses in their high school. So if you look at other people in other high schools and they say they're taking like 20 APs, I would really um I would really not pay attention to that because admissions officers look at each high school individually. So if a high school only offers two APs and the student takes two APs, they would consider that the high schooler kind of like maxed out. Yet if another high school offers 11 APs and the student only took two APs, they would say that the student did not max out and take the most rigorous course load. So if you're at least, I'm not sure if a lot of you are based in the Fremont area or the Bay Area, but if you are, a lot of the schools do offer a lot of courses. So I would take the hardest course load if you want to get into like a very hard to get into school. And if you're still not challenged enough, I would also take like dual enrollment. But then my second piece of advice would also be try to figure out what you like and try to explore. Like for the first year in high school, you kind of have the opportunity to try out a lot of things. And if you don't like them, you can quit. So you can try out like mock trial, robotics, dance, I don't know, like any other like volunteering. And then whatever you find interesting, you can pursue. Because if you do that later on in your high school career, it might be kind of tight to like actually go deep into like a specific field. But if you do that early on, then you can figure out what you like early on.
Cool, perfect. So what are some strategies that you use for your AP exams? And if you feel comfortable sharing, what scores did you receive?
Yeah, so like for the strategies, I wouldn't say I have anything unique. I think I took most of my APs within the school system, like within American High. So I think my teachers like prepared me pretty well. And if you pay attention and you get like A's and B's, you should be pretty well prepared to take the AP test. And then maybe like a month before I started studying with like with like a small group of friends. And like for some of them I used study books, but mostly I stuck to like Khan Academy. And most of the study books I bought I didn't really use. So but I would say like if you try really hard during the school year, you should be very well prepared for the AP test. And you shouldn't need like excessive studying like really late on. And then for my scores, I don't I don't have my exact scores on me, but I think I received out of like my 11 tests, I think I got like seven or eight fives. Um, I got like a few fours and then I think one three. So, but that's like kind of like rough. But yeah, it was definitely mostly fives and then a few fours.
Okay, perfect. And so what are some tips that you have for students to maintain a solid GPA?
Yeah, so like I think it's just priority. Like for me, just speaking like very candidly, I didn't have a good GPA at all. Like my unweighted GPA was quite low, but I kind of compensated for that with taking more AP classes, which kind of boosted my weighted GPA, as well as going very deep in my extracurriculars. So if you do prioritize your grades, um, then and if you spend enough time on them, then I think it's really possible to get like a really high GPA. But if you're willing to like prioritize other things like extracurriculars, um, then you wouldn't be able to focus on two things like very effectively, and your grades may drop. But if you think that's worth it, I wouldn't discourage you from doing that, and that's something I did. So, although my grades were lower than, yeah, my unweighted GPA was like around like 3.7 or 3.8. So, although it's not like extremely low for for some of the top schools, it is like lower than their like expected margin. So, but my weighted GPA was like around like 4.25 to 3. So taking extra APs was worth it. But it's like answering the question, it really depends on priority. And I wouldn't say prioritizing your extracurriculars over your grades is a horrible thing as long as you maintain like a high GPA. Like looking back, I would have maintained a higher GPA because you just need to put in the time. Like it doesn't like for most of the classes, they aren't insanely hard unless you take like a very, very rigorous course load. So yeah.
Okay. The next question was, where did you complete your volunteer hours, and do you think it left an impression on your college mission officers?
Okay. Yeah. So since I led my own nonprofit, I got all of my volunteer hours there. Like during our year, I think we only required to submit 30 hours. So they didn't let me submit anymore. But I think in total, I probably had over like 400 to 500 hours. And I got the Presidential Service Award, which I think requires you to get like 400 hours within one calendar year. But I didn't really talk about that on my application. So I don't think like the number of hours really matters because as long as you hit that lower bar, because everyone kind of like does that. But I think if you instead talk about like the actual work you're doing within the hours. So for example, let's say you volunteered at a hospital and were shadowing and you got volunteer hours through that. Instead of talking about like I got 100 hours, if you actually talk about the things you learned and the things you did, I think that would actually leave a greater impact within your essays and other parts. Yeah.
Cool. And have you done any research or internship? Or other than research.
Um, I think all the internships I did were research. Yeah. And they were all over the summer.
Cool. And did you have a counselor for your essays, or did you write them on your own? And what would you recommend?
Yeah, so I did write my essays on my own, but I did have a counselor to kind of like review my essays. But I would say um like a counselor does help, but I wouldn't say it's essential. Like if you've done a lot of research in the college admissions process and you kind of know what they see, then and you know what they want, like I wouldn't say it's necessary. For the essays, it was really helpful, but there like if you kind of like learn everything online, which was most of the stuff I did, I kind of used the online resources about the process like a lot, then you can kind of minimize and you won't sometimes you might not even need a counselor to like revise the essays. Like sometimes I had my friends review them, which some people do discourage, but yeah, I don't think it's essential.
Cool. Um, so how did you get your research opportunities at Stanford and MIT?
For me, it was purely cold email. And I think that's one of the like some people kind of discount emailing, but for me it worked really well. Like during my sophomore year, I emailed like a lot of professors with like really personalized emails. And a lot of them responded and I had meetings with a lot of them. And what they kind of helped me with was figuring out what I like. So someone asked in the chat, like, how did you decide on environmental science as your interest area? Like initially I was unsure, but I spoke to a lot of professors and it seemed like that was like a big issue that I could have solved through my work. So I kind of liked like I didn't want to focus on something that I would have little impact in. And there I also didn't know a lot of people working on those issues. So that kind of stood out to me. But those meetings with those professors really helped me figure that out. and they were able to connect me with different people and find research opportunities, a lot of labs. Like if you're interested in a specific area, if you can find a lab at any university that's really like niche and really researches that interest area, um, just like a few emails to them might land you an internship because they are looking for research assistants and they are willing to help students kind of like navigate navigate academia. So yeah, like I would send a lot of emails and you might get a lot of yeses.
And what was your nonprofit based on?
So what I realized during like my sophomore year was that there weren't a lot of nonprofits focused on restoring and preserving biodiversity within the Bay Area. And you probably hear about a lot of nonprofits working on trash pickup or protests within like the environmental space, but not a lot of them are working on like engineering the actual solutions to restoring biodiversity. So I thought like why can't I just create that nonprofit? So our mission statement is restoring and preserving biodiversity by advancing like innovation. So and it's called Beyond Terra. And if you go to beyondterra.org, you can kind of like learn more about that. But yeah, we wanted to tackle that really specific problem within the Bay Area.
Next question is, did you think that we shouldn't write Boy Scout leadership in personal statements for Common App?
Yeah, so I was actually a Boy Scout. I went all the way to Life Scout and I didn't complete Eagle. And I didn't mention it. Like I did mention it in the Common App. So in the Common App, you can list all of your extracurriculars individually. And that was one of the ones that I listed. And I think you can list up to 20. But within the personal statement, I did not list it because I instead focused on like my journey through gardening and kind of like research. A lot of people do Boy Scouts, so it's less unique than something like a bit more personal, like gardening for me. So I would say that if if Boy Scouts is the most prominent part of your story, then you can talk about it because there are a lot of like unique stories that you can generate. But if there's something that you've done that's a bit more unique and a bit more personal to you, I would not include Boy Scouts within your personal statement. Um, but yeah,
Right. And is weighted or GPA or unweighted GPA more important?
I would say unweighted GPA is much more important because that kind of shows your raw uh, like score. But like every college kind of like calculates it differently, and the UCs have their own system where they kind of like ignore a few years. So I wouldn't really worry about the number itself. But if you're like just starting high school, I would just focus on getting as many like A's as possible. Like, and this is kind of like really basic stuff, but if you can minimize as many B's as you can get, that would like maximize your probability of getting into a better university. Um, like I think something I've heard was like if you can keep it under 2 or 3, that's a really good number. For me, I got many more, so like I'm probably not the best example, but if you can minimize your B's, that's ideal. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Um, and the next question was, do you have any recommendations for how to find internships? Any good sources?
So like there's a lot like within your school, if you talk to your school counselor or your teachers, they would have like a lot of internships that they have in mind because students do similar internships every single year. And depending on the field, there's like some internships that stand out versus others. Also for like summer programs, which are not exactly internships, some of them like you can only do during your junior year. Like there's one of them called RSI, which is like a really hard to get into program, and you can only do it during your like junior year, like going into senior year. And most of the people that do it get into like really top colleges. So I would talk to, and you can also use online sources, but all of those would just have official internships. Like the internships I did were more unofficial because I preferred an unstructured curriculum rather than like a structured curriculum that these internships offer. So if you do prefer something that's like a bit less like curated, you could just email professors and then join them in the summer. Like that's what I did for my MIT internship. I just sent the professor an email. He said, and I was like, "Can I come over for the summer?" He said, "Sure." And then I lived in Boston for a month, working in his lab. So, and that was not an official internship. So it really depends on like what you prefer. But for some fields like medicine, there's a lot of internships that are on the book, that students do every year, that your AP Bio or like AP Chem teacher should know really well. Yeah.
Cool. So the next question is, what factors did you consider when picking your college list?
For me, like the main factors I chose were like the ranking for the degree I was looking for. Like for environmental science, like Cornell, which was the school that I like did the binding ED to, they have like the number one program within my field. So that's kind of what made me like commit that hard. Some people have other preferences like location or like weather or like school size and on, or even ranking, overall ranking. But for me, I didn't, those didn't really matter to me more. They always say like have like a few reach schools, a few safeties, and a few in the middle. And that's what I kind of did. I kind of had I had like maybe like 5 or 6 safeties, 5 or 6 reaches, and then majority in the middle, which I knew I would get into. But yeah.
Okay. And how are you invited to your public talks?
For me, they were all like from like personal invitation. So like since I was like featured on the media for like through the work I've done, people were able to like find me and invite me to these talks. So they weren't really things I applied for, but it was more things that I was invited to because of the work I was doing within my extracurriculars.
And how did you get so many research opportunities with professors?
For me, I just it was two things. The first one was priority. Like I really prioritized research because I was interested in it, and that allowed me to commit more time to it, instead of working on something else. And then the second thing was I just had like a really strategic approach where I sent like a high volume of emails at a lot of professors that were really like niche within my field. And like even if 10% of them said yes, which a lower percentage said like even responded, um, a lot of people would have said yes. So let's say you send 100 emails and 10% respond, that's 10 responses. And if 20% of that 10% say yes to doing research, that's like 2 people. So that's like 2 professors that you can do research under. So if you're willing to prioritize that, I would I would just kind of like demonstrate your interest by reaching out to people within that field.
Okay. And how many colleges did you apply to?
So like I applied to the UCs, all of the UCs except Merced. So is that like 6 or 7? I don't know. Then I applied to University of Michigan, Santa Clara University, and then Cornell. And all of these were in like the early round, which was around like October, November. And then once I got into Cornell, or like I was planning on applying to like the rest of the Ivies, and then a few other top universities. But after I got into Cornell, I wasn't able to do that. So, and I had to remove my UC applications and my UMich applications. So technically, I only applied to 2 universities, and I got into 2 universities. and the rest I had to either remove or I wasn't able to complete.
Okay, and so how many colleges do you suggest people should apply to?
For me, on my list, there were 20 colleges, but it really depends on like a lot of things. Like, for example, if you have a really strong application and you believe it's like very strong, sorry, then you might not need to apply to as many colleges. But if you think your application's a bit weaker, then you can apply to more safeties and more target schools. That way, if like admissions officers don't love your essays or whatever, you do have that support in the back end in case it goes bad. But I would I think like between like 15 to 20 is like a safe number, like including the UCs. So like when you like factor out the UCs, it would be like maybe like around 13 colleges with like a few of them being safeties, a few of them being like reaches, and a few of them being like target schools. Yeah, but like most of the time will be spent on writing like the supplemental essays for the individual colleges. And I really would discourage you guys from like copy pasting supplementals because each college really like needs like its own unique like essay. And some colleges have like multiple essays. Like for example, for Cornell, I think there were like three to five essays. And then for my major specifically, there were like another two essays. So you really want to get started on that early. You can have like a few essays that are like pretty general and you can like use them and make them specific based on the question the college is asking. But yeah, like I applied to like around, or I would have applied to around like 19 or 20. Yeah.
Cool. Cool. And so when the question was for your cold emails, did you reach out to professors only in the environmental science field, or did you send it through like a different variety of majors?
For me, it was even more specific than environmental science. Like by the time I was emailing them, I was very interested in this specific field called like fungal and biodiversity research. So I was like, what I did was the previous summer I did this research internship where I analyzed fungi, and I read a lot of research papers, and a few scientists I kept seeing over and over again in the papers I read. So that kind of interested me, and I looked up their name and I was reading what their lab did, and I realized that a lot of the work their lab did was very similar to what I was interested in, and it was very, very niche. It wasn't environmental science, it was more like fungal disturbance research, which is a very, very small field with maybe like less than like 1,000 researchers globally. So if you're able to find that really specific field that you're interested in, then there would be like a very small number of scientists, and a lot of them at really good universities. And you can look at the work their lab is doing, and if that aligns with your research interest, I would reach out to them. So my process was like reading papers because that's what I was already doing in my research journey, and then seeing like the primary authors on those papers, looking them up, looking at their labs. Like some of them were based in like Switzerland at like ETH Zurich. Some of them were based in like the Bay Area at Stanford. Some of them were based in like Arizona. So it was kind of all over the place. But I emailed like maybe like 50 or maybe like 30 to 50 people over the span of like 4 months. And then the people that I responded to, I like set up meetings with, I talked to them, and then I like try to set up research opportunities. But it was during the pandemic. So a lot of the research opportunities I wasn't able to get because I would have had to go into the field, and it was very like regulated at the time. But it should be better now.
Mhm. And what type of jobs do usually someone who's taken an environmental scientist, a science major, tech, like get?
Yeah, so if you do environmental science, you can work at like a nonprofit doing research. You can, but most people I've seen get like a graduate degree, like a PhD. And if you do get a PhD after getting like an environmental science degree in undergrad, you can do environmental science research. You can also join like companies that are doing like forestry. You can join paper companies. For example, I was talking to this forester the other day, and he works at a pretty prominent sustainable paper company. You can work, so that's like industry jobs. You can also like lead your own NGO. But yeah, if you get a PhD, it's a lot of like academia jobs. Um, but for me, I'm both studying environmental science, but also like applied math and a bit more technical stuff because I'm interested in kind of like the engineering aspects of like tackling environmental problems. Which is why I'm not just getting that degree because just an environmental science degree is pretty unemployable from what I've seen. So yeah.
And then the question I will copy paste in chat really quickly, but basically they were asking why were you interested in environmental sciences and not environmental engineering?
Yeah, so when I looked at environmental engineering, it seemed like pretty like all over the place. Like I was looking for a really technical degree, um, which is why I'm planning on double majoring in like environmental science, which is a bit more broad because it's like a mix of like sociology, like biology and chemistry and physics with like a bit of um, like policy research and like policy work. Um, but like an environmental engineering degree is kind of all of that plus like some mechanical engineering and computer science. And I thought learning all of that in one degree wouldn't really give me the depth I'm looking for. So instead, I'm planning on double majoring where I get a really technical degree as well as like something a bit more broad, but in the field that I'm interested in pursuing. But it's really like personal preference. Like environmental engineering programs are getting very popular. And I do know a few people in them right now.
Cool, cool. And that was it for the questions. So I think what we can do now is we can open it to the audience for a few more minutes to see if they want to unmute and ask a question, or if they have a question they want to put in the chat. And we'll go from there. And if not, Rishi will end the session. So we'll wait for a few minutes to see if anyone has any questions that they come up with, or if they want to put a question in the chat.
So, hi, congratulations, and your what are your doing in undergrad? Like, what is your double major? You said double majoring, right? So, I just wanted to know what are the double majors.
Yeah, so I'm going to be double majoring in environmental science and applied math. So it's like an engineering degree or like a mathematics degree as well as um, like an environmental science degree.
Okay, any other questions?
One question I have on the community contribution or maybe the volunteering, right? Did it looks like most majority of your work is towards research, and did you ever focus on any community contributions?
Yeah, I'd actually say a majority of my work is community contributions. I didn't get to talk about it a lot today, but some of the most like prominent stuff I've done was I helped pass, like I kind of mentioned this, but I helped pass a climate literacy resolution at the Board of Education in Fremont. And that led, what that basically led to is the mandatory teaching of climate change for all grades in Fremont USD, in both the sciences and the humanities. So I was able to take that in Fremont and also get it passed at Berkeley Unified School District, Oakland Unified School District, and Los Angeles Unified School District. And in total, that's around 700,000 students that are now going to be taught environmental science. So that was like, I talked about that a lot in my college application, and in some of my essays, I kind of just talked about that specifically. And then there was some other stuff I did, like at the Sierra Club, which is like a local NGO, where we did like conservation work and some policy work. Like I was in Washington, D.C. a few months ago, where we were trying to pass a climate education bill through the House of Representatives, and also a youth climate mental health bill. So I was able to meet with a lot of senators and assembly members and like lobby for that to get passed. So I kind of did like a lot of policy work, and I guess that counts as community contributions on my end. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent, and congratulations. Thank you on this information. This is very informational. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Cool. Any last minute questions before we wrap up this session? Okay. If not, thank you all so much for joining today's session. Thank you, Rishi, for joining today's session and sharing very insightful information about your high school experience and your journey through the college admissions process. I'm sure a lot of people found it very, very informational. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and that is it for today's session. Thank you.